Woman finds old family photo in a thrift store, looks closer, and realizes who's beside her grandmother. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of the thrift store on Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard as Sarah Mitchell pushed through the heavy glass door, shaking droplets from her jacket. It was a gray Saturday afternoon in Portland, the kind that made staying inside with a book seem like the only reasonable choice. But Sarah had promised herself she'd find a vintage mirror for her apartment, and she wasn't one to break promises, even to herself. The store smelled of old wood, mothballs, and that peculiar mustiness that clings to objects with forgotten histories. Sarah moved through the narrow aisles, past stacks of mismatched dishes, worn leather suitcases, and shelves crowded with paperback novels whose spines had faded to illegibility. She taught American history at Roosevelt High School, and thrift stores had always fascinated her, each object a silent witness to lives lived, stories untold. Near the back, wedged between a cracked vase and a box of yellowed postcards, she spotted it. Not a mirror, but something that made her pause. A photograph. Old, very old. She reached for it carefully, her fingers recognizing the weight and texture of early 20th century photographic paper. Thick, brittle, with that distinctive feel that modern prints never quite replicated. The image was in black and white, severely aged, with a sepia tint creeping in from the edges. The surface was covered in the granular texture, typical of photographs from the turn of the century, scattered with small spots and marks where time had left its fingerprints. The corners were bent, the paper worn soft from handling or neglect. Sarah held it up to the dusty window light. The photograph showed a group of black people, perhaps 12 or 15, standing together in what appeared to be a port or industrial area. Large warehouse structures loomed in the background. The camera had been positioned far away, maybe 15 or 20 meters, making the figures small within the frame. Their faces weren't immediately clear through the grain and distance, but something pulled at her, something familiar. She moved closer to the window, angling the photograph to catch more light. The group was dressed formally, the women in long, dark dresses and modest hats, the men in suits. Several people held luggage or cloth bundles. They stood with the uncertain posture of travelers, of people caught between destinations. Sarah's eyes moved across the faces, struggling against the distance and deterioration. Then she stopped. The third from the left. A young woman, slender, wearing a dark dress with long sleeves and a small hat. Sarah's breath caught. She knew that face, or thought she did. Her grandmother had shown her exactly one photograph of her great-great-grandmother, Eleanor. Just one. Taken years later, when Eleanor was middle-aged, her face worn by time and hardship. But Sarah had stared at that photograph countless times as a child, memorizing every feature. This young woman in the 1903 photograph. It was Eleanor. And standing beside her was someone impossible. Someone whose face Sarah recognized from every history textbook she'd ever taught from, Booker T. Washington. Sarah stood frozen in the thrift store aisle, the photograph trembling in her hands. Around her, other customers browsed peacefully, oblivious to the earthquake that had just rearranged her understanding of her family's past. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Someone laughed near the front of the store. Everything was ordinary except for the impossible object she held. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and searched Booker T. Washington, 1903. Images flooded her screen, formal portraits, public appearances, posed photographs from the exact era. She compared them to the man standing beside Eleanor, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the store could hear it. The distinctive facial structure, the high forehead and neat mustache, the particular way he held himself, upright, dignified, projecting the careful respectability he was famous for cultivating. The style of his suit, formal and meticulous, every detail matched. But what would Booker T. Washington, the most influential black leader in America at the turn of the century, founder of the Tuskegee Institute, advisor to presidents, be doing in a photograph with her great-great-grandmother? A woman her family had barely spoken about. A woman whose life had been reduced to whispers and gaps. Sarah turned the photograph over with trembling hands. The back was blank except for a faint stamp in the corner, barely legible. J. Morrison. Photography, New York, 1903. New York. Eleanor had come from New York. That much Sarah knew, though the details had always been frustratingly sparse. She looked around the store, suddenly aware of how surreal the moment felt. She was holding something extraordinary, something that could rewrite everything she thought she knew about her family, and she'd found it wedged between a cracked vase and a box of postcards. How had this photograph ended up here? How had it traveled from New York in 1903 to a Portland thrift store in 2024? Who had owned it all these years? And why? Why had no one in her family ever mentioned that Eleanor had known Booker T. Washington? Sarah carried the photograph to the register, her legs unsteady. The clerk, a young woman with purple hair and multiple piercings, glanced at it without interest. "How much for this?" Sarah asked, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. The clerk shrugged. $2. Sarah handed over the money, barely registering the transaction. She slid the photograph carefully into her purse, protecting it from the rain as she stepped back outside. The November cold hit her face, sharp and clarifying. She stood on the sidewalk, letting the rain mist against her skin, trying to slow her racing thoughts. She had to know, she had to understand what this meant. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now. Sarah pulled out her phone and canceled her evening plans, then drove directly to the Multnomah County Library, her mind racing faster than the windshield wipers could clear the rain. Sarah claimed a spot at one of the research tables in the library's history section, carefully removing the photograph from her purse and placing it under the bright LED lights. Under this illumination, the image seemed even more impossible. Eleanor's young face stared back at her through more than a century of distance, and beside her stood Booker T. Washington. She opened her laptop and began with what she knew. Eleanor had been born somewhere in the South, Georgia or Alabama, family stories suggested, though no one had ever been certain. She'd come north sometime around the turn of the century. She'd lived in New York before eventually moving to Philadelphia, where she'd spent most of her life. She'd had a daughter named Ruth, Sarah's great-grandmother, born around 1904. Eleanor had died in 1967. That was it. That was the sum total of what Sarah had been told. She pulled up genealogy databases, census records, immigration documents. Searching for Eleanor with no last name and approximate dates was like trying to find a specific raindrop in a storm. Thousands of results appeared, none obviously connected to her family. Sarah sat back, frustrated. She needed a different approach. She examined the photograph again, the warehouse structures in the background, the way the people were arranged, the luggage they carried. This wasn't a casual photograph. Someone had organized this. Someone had gathered these people together for a specific purpose and hired a photographer to document it. The stamp on the back, J. Morrison Photography, New York, 1903. Sarah typed the name into the search bar. Several minutes of digging revealed that J. Morrison had been a commercial photographer operating in Lower Manhattan in the early 1900s, specializing in portrait and documentary work. His studio had been located near the Port District. The Port District. That made sense given the warehouse backgrounds. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for anything connecting Booker T. Washington to New York in 1903. She found lecture schedules, newspaper announcements, mentions in society columns. Washington had been in New York frequently that year, giving speeches, meeting with philanthropists, raising money for Tuskegee. Then she found something that made her sit up straighter. An article from the New York Age, a black newspaper dated September 15, 1903. The headline read, "Professor Washington recruits teachers and craftspeople for Tuskegee Institute. 30 selected for journey south." Sarah's heart hammered as she read. The article described how Booker T. Washington had spent several weeks in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, personally interviewing and selecting qualified black teachers, artisans, and craftspeople to join the staff at Tuskegee. The selected individuals had gathered at a location near the Manhattan port before departing by train for Alabama. September 1903. The same date on the photograph. Was this that gathering? Were these the recruits? Was Eleanor one of the people selected to go to Tuskegee? But if so, why had she never gone? Sarah spent the entire Sunday in the library returning the moment it opened. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with questions. She started with the Tuskegee Institute archives, which had been digitized and made available online. The website contained thousands of documents, correspondence, employment records, photographs, financial ledgers. She searched for Eleanor and filtered by date, 1903 to 1905. Dozens of results appeared. She began reading through records of female employees, teachers, matrons, laundry workers, kitchen staff. So many women, so many lives dedicated to Booker T. Washington's vision of black education and self-sufficiency. But none named Eleanor matched the timeline. None had arrived in September 1903 from New York. Sarah tried a different approach. She searched for lists of recruits who'd been selected but never arrived. She found scattered references, people who'd accepted positions but withdrew due to family obligations, illness, or other opportunities. Then she found it. A letter dated August 12, 1903, from Booker T. Washington's office to someone named Eleanor Jackson in New York City. The letter began, "Dear Miss Jackson, we are pleased to inform you that following your interview with Professor Washington on August 8th, you have been selected to join the Tuskegee Institute as an instructor in sewing and domestic arts." Sarah's hands shook as she read, Eleanor Jackson. The letter detailed the position, teaching sewing, mending, and dressmaking to female students. It outlined the salary and the expected start date, October 1st, 1903, after the group's departure from New York in late September. This had to be her Eleanor. The dates aligned perfectly. Jackson must have been Eleanor's maiden name, but what had happened? Why had Eleanor Jackson never arrived at Tuskegee? Sarah searched for more correspondence. She found a second letter, dated September 20th, 1903, from Washington's secretary to Eleanor Jackson. "We regret to receive your communication regarding your inability to join our faculty as planned. Professor Washington asks that you reconsider, as your skills and character made a strong impression. Should circumstances change, please do not hesitate to contact us. Eleanor had withdrawn. Just days before the photograph was taken, she'd informed Tuskegee that she couldn't come. Why? Sarah's mother had mentioned that Eleanor worked as a seamstress, sewing and domestic arts that matched the position at Tuskegee. Everything fit together except for one crucial piece. What had prevented Eleanor from accepting this incredible opportunity? Sarah kept searching. She found a church bulletin from St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Manhattan, dated October 1903. A small notice in the community announcements: the congregation offers prayers for Miss Eleanor Jackson, who has withdrawn from her planned journey due to personal circumstances. May she find peace and strength in this difficult time. Personal circumstances. What did that mean? Sarah stared at the photograph again. Eleanor stood in that group, surrounded by people about to embark on a journey that would change their lives. Had she known, when this photograph was taken, that she wouldn't be joining them? Monday morning, Sarah called in sick to work, something she almost never did. She couldn't focus on teaching when her mind was consumed by this mystery. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She booked a last-minute flight to New York for that afternoon, using money she'd been saving for a summer trip. This was more important. This was her family's hidden history, waiting to be uncovered. By Tuesday morning, she was sitting in the reading room of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, one of the most comprehensive archives of African American history in the world. The archival librarian, a woman named Patricia with silver locks and sharp, intelligent eyes, had listened to Sarah's story with growing interest. "You think your great-great-grandmother was recruited by Booker T. Washington himself?" Patricia had asked, examining the photograph. "I found the recruitment letter, but I can't find any record of her actually arriving at Tuskegee." Now Patricia brought out boxes of materials, copies of the New York Age and other black newspapers from 1903, church bulletins from Harlem and Brooklyn congregations, records from mutual aid societies. Sarah worked methodically through each document, scanning for any mention of Eleanor Jackson. Then, in a church bulletin from St. Philip's Episcopal Church, she found another reference, this time in the marriage announcements. Miss Eleanor Jackson and Mr. Thomas Hayes were united in holy matrimony on September 24th, 1903. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Bishop. May God bless their union. Sarah stared at the words, her heart pounding. September 24th, 1903. Just days before the photograph had been taken, just days before Eleanor was supposed to leave for Tuskegee. Thomas Hayes, a name she'd never heard before. A man who'd existed and then vanished from family history. "Patricia," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "She got married, right before she was supposed to leave." Patricia came over to look. That would explain why she withdrew. Marriage would have changed everything. But why has no one ever mentioned him? My family never spoke about anyone named Thomas Hayes? Patricia's expression was thoughtful. "Let me check the death records." 20 minutes later, Patricia returned with a grim expression. "I found him. Thomas Hayes. Died March 17th, 1904. Age 26. Cause of death: industrial accident, Brooklyn Navy Yard. 6 months. Eleanor and Thomas had been married for only 6 months before he died. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She gave up Tuskegee for him. She gave up working with Booker T. Washington. And then he died. "And then what happened to her?" Patricia asked softly. Sarah pulled out her phone, searching her family tree notes. "She eventually moved to Philadelphia. She married a man named James Foster. He's the man my family remembers as her husband." "When did she marry James?" Sarah searched through her notes, then looked up obituaries online. "I don't know exactly, but must have been soon after Thomas died. My great-grandmother Ruth was born in May 1904. The timeline clicked into place with devastating clarity. Eleanor had been pregnant when Thomas died. Sarah sat in a coffee shop near the Schomburg Center, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. Her notebook lay open in front of her, filled with fragments of a story that was slowly, painfully coming into focus. Eleanor Jackson, interviewed personally by Booker T. Washington in August 1903, selected for a prestigious position at Tuskegee Institute, and then, just weeks before departure, she'd married Thomas Hayes. Had she loved him? Had they known each other before the Tuskegee recruitment, or had they met during the selection process? Sarah examined the photograph again, looking for a man who might have been Thomas. Several young men stood in the group, but at this distance and through the degradation of age, their faces were difficult to distinguish. The New York Age article about the Tuskegee recruits had mentioned carpenters among those selected. Thomas's death certificate listed him as a carpenter at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He must have been part of the same recruitment group. Sarah imagined them meeting during the interview process, two young people far from home, both talented enough to catch Washington's attention. Had they fallen in love quickly? Had Eleanor discovered she was pregnant and made the only choice available to a woman in 1903? Marriage instead of Tuskegee? A husband instead of a dream? And then, just 6 months later, Thomas was dead. Killed in an industrial accident, one of thousands of workers who died building America's ships and bridges and buildings. Eleanor would have been 21, widowed, pregnant, or with a newborn infant, alone in New York City. Sarah's phone buzzed. Patricia had texted, "Found another church record. You need to see this." Sarah hurried back to the Schomburg Center. Patricia had a ledger open on the table, her finger pointing to an entry. "Saint, Phillips kept detailed records. Look at this." It was a baptismal record. Ruth Hayes, born May 3rd, 1904, daughter of Eleanor Hayes and Thomas Hayes, deceased, baptized June 5th, 1904. Ruth Hayes, not Ruth Foster. Sarah's great-grandmother had been born Ruth Hayes. "Now look at this," Patricia said, flipping several pages forward in the ledger. Eleanor Hayes married James Foster on June 12, 1904. Just 1 week after Ruth's baptism, the ceremony was performed by the same reverend. 1 week. Eleanor had waited just 1 week after baptizing her daughter with her dead husband's name before remarrying. "She had no choice," Sarah whispered. "She was a widow with an infant. She needed someone to provide for them." Patricia nodded. It was survival, pure and simple. Women in her position had very few options. But then why did everyone forget about Thomas? Why did my great-grandmother grow up thinking James was her father? Because Eleanor needed James to accept Ruth as his daughter. She needed to erase Thomas to build a new life. It was the only way forward. Sarah felt a profound sadness settle over her. Eleanor had made impossible choices, each one erasing a piece of her history. First, she'd given up Tuskegee and Booker T. Washington's mentorship for love and survival. Then, she'd buried Thomas's memory to secure her daughter's future. Sarah flew back to Portland, but she couldn't let the story go. She requested records from Philadelphia, where Eleanor had spent the rest of her life. Over the next week, documents arrived via email, census records, city directories, death certificates. The Foster family, Eleanor, James, and Ruth, appeared in the 1910 census, living in South Philadelphia. James worked as a factory laborer. Eleanor's occupation was listed as seamstress, home. Ruth was 6 years old, listed as James's daughter. No mention of Thomas Hayes. No indication that James was Ruth's stepfather. Sarah found city directories from the 1920s and 1930s. The Fosters had moved to a slightly better neighborhood. James's occupation had improved to factory foreman. Eleanor still worked as a seamstress. Ruth had married and moved out. By the 1950 census, Eleanor and James were in their 60s. They'd never had other children. Ruth had given them grandchildren, including Sarah's grandmother. James died in 1956. Eleanor lived another 11 years as a widow, dying in 1967 at age 87. A long life, a hard life, a life built on necessary silences. Sarah called her mother and told her everything she'd discovered. Her mother listened quietly, asking occasional questions. "Your grandmother never mentioned anyone named Thomas Hayes?" Sarah asked. "Never. As far as we knew, James was Grandma Ruth's father." "Are you sure about this?" "I have the birth certificate. Ruth was born Ruth Hayes, 2 months after Thomas died. Eleanor didn't marry James until Ruth was a month old." Her mother was silent for a long moment. "That's heartbreaking. Eleanor lost everything, her dream of Tuskegee, her husband, her whole future, and then had to pretend none of it ever happened." "Do you think Grandma Ruth knew?" "I don't know. Maybe Eleanor told her when she was older, or maybe Ruth found out somehow and decided to keep the secret too. It's hard to say." Oh, Sarah thought about secrets and silence, about the stories families bury because they're too painful or too complicated. She thought about Eleanor, who had stood next to Booker T. Washington in 1903, chosen for her skills and character, on the verge of a remarkable life, and had instead spent decades as a seamstress in Philadelphia, her connection to history forgotten. "I want to find out more about Thomas," Sarah said. "He deserves to be remembered too." Her mother agreed. "He's our family. He should be part of our story." Over the following weeks, Sarah pieced together what she could about Thomas Hayes. He'd been born in Virginia in 1878, the son of formerly enslaved people. He'd learned carpentry as a young man, and had come north seeking better opportunities. He'd been skilled enough to be selected by Booker T. Washington's recruiters for Tuskegee, and then he'd met Eleanor, and their lives had changed course entirely. Sarah reached out to historians who specialized in Booker T., Washington, and the Tuskegee Institute. She sent them copies of the photograph, explained her research, and asked if they could confirm her findings. Dr. Raymond Carter, a professor at Howard University who'd written extensively about Tuskegee, responded enthusiastically. "This is a remarkable find," he wrote. "I can confirm with near certainty that this is Booker T. Washington. The photograph matches others from the same period, and the context you've provided makes perfect sense historically." He continued, "Washington made several recruitment trips to northern cities in 1903. He personally selected faculty and staff, believing that the quality of Tuskegee's instructors was crucial to the Institute's mission. Many people were recruited but never arrived for various reasons: family obligations, financial difficulties, health issues, or simply cold feet about moving to the rural South. Dr. Carter asked permission to include Sarah's photograph in a research paper he was writing about Tuskegee's early recruitment efforts. This fills in a gap in our understanding of how Washington built his faculty. Personal stories like Eleanor's help us understand the human dimension of these historical movements. Sarah agreed, with the condition that both Eleanor Jackson and Thomas Hayes be properly credited and remembered. She also contacted the Tuskegee University archives directly. They were excited to learn about the photograph and asked for a high-resolution scan. They had no record of Eleanor Jackson in their employment files, but they found her name in Washington's correspondence, confirming the recruitment letter Sarah had already found. "It's not uncommon," the archivist explained during a phone call. "Many people were invited who never came. Life intervened. But that doesn't make their stories less important. These were real people making difficult choices." Sarah began writing everything down, creating a comprehensive document of Eleanor's story. She included copies of every record she'd found: the recruitment letter, the marriage certificate, Thomas's death certificate, the baptismal record, the census entries. She wanted future generations to know the truth. She shared the document with her mother, who shared it with other family members. Reactions varied. Some were fascinated, eager to learn more. Others seemed uncomfortable, as though Sarah had violated some unspoken family rule by uncovering what had been deliberately buried. Her cousin Marcus, a lawyer in Atlanta, called her directly. "This is incredible, Sarah. I had no idea our family had this connection to Booker T. Washington. Why didn't anyone tell us?" "I think Eleanor wanted to forget," Sarah said. "It represented everything she'd lost. Maybe it was too painful to talk about." "Or maybe," Marcus suggested, "the family was ashamed. An out-of-wedlock pregnancy, even if she married quickly, that would have been scandalous in their community. Better to bury it and move on." "Ruth wasn't born out of wedlock," Sarah corrected. "Eleanor married Thomas. Ruth was legitimate, but yes, I think the quick remarriage after Thomas died complicated things. Easier to pretend James was always her father." "Either way," Marcus said, "you've given us back a piece of our history. That matters." 6 months after finding the photograph, Sarah stood in the community room of the Multnomah County Library, looking at the exhibition she'd helped create. The library's local history department had been enthusiastic about telling Eleanor's story as part of their ongoing project documenting the lives of Black Americans in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. The centerpiece was the photograph, now professionally preserved and mounted behind glass. Beside it, Sarah had created a timeline of Eleanor's life with copies of the documents she'd found: the Tuskegee recruitment letter, the marriage certificate, newspaper clippings, census records. She titled the exhibition, "The Photograph and the Dream: Eleanor Jackson's Journey from Tuskegee to Philadelphia." The text panel explained, "In August 1903, Eleanor Jackson was personally selected by Booker T. Washington to join the faculty of the Tuskegee Institute as an instructor in sewing and domestic arts. Just weeks before her planned departure, Eleanor married Thomas Hayes, a carpenter who had also been recruited for Tuskegee. This photograph, taken in September 1903 at the New York port, captures the moment before the recruits departed for Alabama, a journey Eleanor would never make. When Thomas died in an industrial accident in March 1904, Eleanor was left widowed with an infant daughter. She remarried quickly for survival, and her first marriage, her connection to Booker T. Washington, and her deferred dreams were gradually erased from family memory. More than 120 years later, this photograph, found in a Portland thrift store, has restored Eleanor's story and given her descendants a connection to a remarkable moment in African American history. Sarah had also included a section about Thomas Hayes, with what little information she'd been able to find. "Thomas Hayes deserves to be remembered," the text read. "He was Eleanor's choice, her love, and the father of her child. His death at age 26 changed the course of multiple generations. His memory, lost for over a century, is now restored." The exhibition opening drew a surprising crowd. Local historians came, fascinated by the Booker T. Washington connection. Genealogists came, interested in Sarah's research methods. Members of Portland's Black community came, moved by Eleanor's story of sacrifice and survival. Sarah's mother flew in from Chicago, bringing Sarah's grandmother. Ruth's daughter, Eleanor's granddaughter. At 82, she moved slowly but with determination, wanting to see the photograph that had rewritten their family history. She stood in front of the image for a long time, tears streaming down her face. "I never knew," she whispered. "My grandmother never told me. My mother never told me. I never knew we had this connection." Sarah put her arm around her grandmother. "Now you do. Now we all do." Her grandmother pointed at Eleanor's face in the photograph. "She was so young. Just a girl, really. And she gave up so much." "She did," Sarah agreed. "But she survived. She built a life. She made sure Ruth had a father and a home. She did what she had to do. And Thomas? Her grandmother asked. Do we know anything else about him? Not much, Sarah admitted. But I'm still looking. I want to find out everything I can. The photograph hung on Sarah's living room wall now, in a place of honor. She'd had a professional reproduction made, and the original was stored in archival conditions, protected for future generations. Every morning she looked at Eleanor's face and thought about choices and consequences, about dreams deferred and lives rebuilt from loss. She thought about how easily stories could be erased, how silence could become permanent if no one asked the right questions. She'd expanded her research, reaching out to descendants of other people who appeared in the photograph. Several families had responded, sharing their own stories. Most had known their ancestors had been recruited by Booker T. Washington. Most had only fragments of family history, passed down through generations that had been taught to look forward rather than back. Together, they were piecing together the larger story of that September day in 1903, when a group of Black Americans had stood at a port in New York, on the verge of joining one of the most important educational experiments in American history. Some had gone to Tuskegee and built careers there. Others, like Eleanor, had been diverted by life's unexpected turns. All of them deserved to be remembered. Sarah had started giving talks at schools and community centers, sharing Eleanor's story and teaching people how to research their own family histories. She emphasized the importance of documents, of asking questions, of not accepting silence as the final answer. History isn't just about famous people, she told her audiences. It's about ordinary people making extraordinary choices. It's about people like Eleanor, who stood next to Booker T, Washington for one moment, whose photograph was taken, and whose story was then buried for over a century. Every family has stories like this. Every family has connections to history that have been forgotten. Your job is to find them. Her own students at Roosevelt High School were fascinated by the story. Several started researching their own families, discovering immigrants and migrants, veterans and activists, ordinary people who had lived through extraordinary times. Sarah had also connected with Thomas Hayes's descendants from his siblings' lines. They'd been shocked to learn about Eleanor and Ruth, about this lost branch of their family tree. They'd welcomed Sarah and her relatives, sharing photographs and stories of their own. Together, they'd visited Thomas's grave in a Brooklyn cemetery. The stone was simple, weathered by more than a century of New York winters. Sarah's grandmother had placed flowers there, kneeling despite her age, speaking quietly to the great-grandfather she'd never known existed. "Thank you for loving Eleanor," she'd said. "Thank you for being Ruth's father. I'm sorry we forgot you, but we remember now." Sarah thought about that moment often, about restoration and recognition, about the power of simple acknowledgement. The photograph had changed everything. It had opened a door to the past and revealed a story that had been waiting to be told. Eleanor had stood next to Booker T. Washington, had been chosen for her skills and character, had made impossible choices, had survived devastating loss, and had built a life despite everything. And now, finally, she was remembered not just as a name in a family tree, but as a full person. Complex, courageous, deeply human. Sarah looked at the photograph one more time. Eleanor stared back through the grain and distance, young and uncertain, standing at the threshold of a future she couldn't imagine. Beside her stood Booker T. Washington, dignified and purposeful, representing a dream that Eleanor would never fulfill. But she had fulfilled other dreams. She had survived. She had raised her daughter. She had lived a long life with quiet dignity. And now, more than 50 years after her death, her story had been reclaimed from silence. That was its own kind of triumph. That was its own kind of justice. And it was, Sarah thought, exactly what Eleanor would have wanted: to be known, to be understood, to be remembered for everything she was and everything she had endured. The photograph had waited more than a century to tell its story. Now, at last, it had found someone willing to listen.